أصحاب السعادة.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, peace be upon you all. His Excellency Dr. Jamal Sanad As-Suwaidi, General Director of the ECSSR, would like to welcome you all and is honored to have you here during this lecture entitled The Press Between Arab and Western Perspectives. It is a part of a series of lectures organized by the ECSSR, hosting international figures which play a pivotal role at the political, economic, and social levels. Ladies and gentlemen, the press has witnessed in the Arab region a clear development, and the development in the field of technology has been very important amid the geopolitical changes taking place in many areas around the world, including the Middle East. This has bolstered the position of the press in the Middle East. The press in the Middle East is no longer closed and blocked. It's now a press that is more open and that can overcome surveillance. The press in the Middle East has gone online, and it has been able to keep pace with these developments, and we still have a clear margin of freedom in the Middle East. However, the journalist sometimes still lacks freedom and is struggling to access information amid the lack of the necessary laws and regulations. Sometimes the news and information is not accurate enough and is not objective and transparent. All of this poses a lot of questions about the causes that have obstructed the development of press in the Middle East, and we will also tackle the challenges of the press in our countries compared to the press in the West. We will also talk about the future of press in the Middle East amid the low rates of reading among the Arab people. We are delighted to host journalist and writer Mr. Jihad Al-Khazen, who will be talking based on his long-standing experience in the field of journalism. Mr. Jihad Al-Khazen is a Lebanese journalist who has been living in London since 1975. He has a bachelor in political science and Arabic literature. Mr. Jihad Al-Khazen has served as a reporter for the Reuters news agency. He was also the first editor-in-chief of Al-Sharq Al-Awsat. He was editor-in-chief of Hayat before writing a daily column in Hayat newspaper. He focused on the new conservatives, and he is one of the leading figures in the field of poetry. He is also a member of the Arab Consultative Council in the US, and he is also a member of the board of advisors of the World Bank in the Middle East and the North Africa region. I'm honored to invite Mr. Jihad Al-Khazen to deliver his lecture about the press between Arab and Western perspectives.
I will not be talking a lot like Cinderella. My plane is at 12 in the evening, so I will not be talking a lot. The press, Arab and Western perspectives. I was lucky in journalism in reality because I was trained in Reuters. I worked in the English newspaper. When I went to London, I started working with the Arab press. I had the capability, and before this and that, I was chief in Reuters. chief leader in Reuters. The traditional or newspaper is news and views. There is nothing else. News and views. The news should be true. The writer should be able to prove that this is true, and the perspective is for the writer. I give you a true news, definitely. The newspapers all over the world will be ending, or it is about to end. The two countries which I know best, UK and USA, every month the sale of newspapers is less compared to last year. They give you the numbers, even the first number, the price and that of something else. I lived in Beirut. I went there 35 years ago. The Telegraph and the Times used to sell more than 10 million copies. Now they sell less than 500,000. It will end, definitely. Your newspapers are prosperous because the country is prosperous. And the newspapers now in the USA, there is a competition with the technology, with the online newspapers, with the internet. So there is competition, definitely, which we do not have, similar to the newspapers that we have in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. As you know, we are backwards from most of the people 10 years. Perhaps we might really be with them after 10 years in the lack of resources and so on and so forth. When I lived in Washington in the 80s, my office was at the Madison. It is called the office building. Facing the Madison was the Washington Post. Ben Bradley, the chief editor back then, used to come to the coffee shop to take his lunch. We were young journalists. We used to see them. If the president is holding a press conference being broadcasted on TV, there's no problem whatsoever. But if they have a news, for instance, the UAE has bought arms and weapons, or is intended to buy weapons from the USA, I do not publish this news unless we make sure that the news is correct from two independent sources, because the news should be correct and true. We really got to know the accuracy from them. In London, if the news is wrong, this is very bad, because they will be really brought to court, and the loser not only gives compensation to the defendant, but also he pays the expenses of the lawyers. It might reach £1 million, UK pounds. I shall tell you two experiences of mine. Soraka, a newspaper, they wrote that I blackmail the Saudi emirs. I go to Saudi Arabia 10 times per year. The next day, they knew their mistake. I really made a case in the court. They paid the expenses. It was about 150,000. I announced in the court, I do not want money for myself. I want to donate them to the Association of the Arab Women. Their yearly dinner was on my expense. My daughter is in Cambridge. She was the head of the water polo team. I gave them £10,000. The girls went to play in South Africa. The South African girls are Amazonian girls. They're very tall, and the Cambridge girls, they played 8 times and they were defeated 8 times, and they came back to tell me why this trip we were better without it. a newspaper really wrote something about me, and one of them really lost in the High Court, very close to my offices. He came and resumed appealed at the court. It cost him £550,000. He went to the the costly lawyer, Peter Carterack, in England. When I've read the first letter, I got afraid because I know that he hasn't really lost a case. He lost in the appeal. So £950,000. He paid about £1,200,000. He paid them in installment, 400,000 or 40,000 pounds per month. I found out after the Israeli Spring, which they called the Arab Spring, after what happened in Egypt, there is something called the complaints in Egypt, al-balaghat in Arabic. If I really complain that a person is a thief, and this person really brings lawyers who defend him, they stay for a year defending him, and he ends up being a victim or he gets acquitted. Ahmed Shafi is a close friend of mine. I always see him. The country has given him a villa in one of the posh hotels. He has 3 girls. They live with him. They tell me that I have no money at all during the age of the Muslim Brotherhood. I used to file cases against all of them, those who accuse him of stealing, and he won all the cases after the demise of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were getting accused and judged. For once in Egypt, those who really accuse someone on purpose, if they pay the expenses of the lawyers, they will not get any complaints whatsoever. This is the issue of complaints in Egypt. In London, it is known. Why? Because the loser will pay for the lawyers. I have noticed on the margin of this issue that the American law is completely different, or is marginally different. In London, the current law, similar to the Sharia law, the honors of proof. If I accuse someone of being a thief and I cannot prove it, he won the case. In the USA, they have another amendment, the 4th Amendment of the Constitution, which confirms the freedom of speech. And therefore, if I accuse someone of stealing, it is not enough to prove that he has done a mistake. The defendant should prove that as a result of the accusation, he became unemployed, he has lost the contract with the government, so there is a tangible damage. If the law is not really proven, so Khalid bin Mahfoud, he has died. He filed 20 cases in London and he won 20 cases. He used to be accused of financing terrorism and evil. The last case, a Jewish American woman who called him financing evil, and he fought the case and he won the case. They wanted her, or they ordered her to damage the book, although the book is really sold in the USA, and she paid him $200,000 as damages. I think that this kind of law protects people, regardless of unlike the Egyptian law. No one gets accountable. Salisbury Square, they really moved from Fleet Street. There is no newspaper whatsoever in London. During that time, Express and other newspapers are all gone now, but back at the time they were there. So they taught us the law. They taught us the importance of journalism is as important as the sources of the news. The journalist is not there to see that I think or I believe. No, this is not not true. You relay the news of the people. You want to write an article, so be it, but you don't give your opinion or perspective. No. In reality, I say that I benefited a lot the Arab presidents from King Hassan II to Sheikh Zayed. Both now are dead, God bless their soul. I knew King Hussein, I knew the President Bashar al-Assad and President Mubarak, and I used to relay news. I have all the news every year from them. I can say, on the margins of what we're saying, the most cultured Arabic president was Hassan II. He is like a mufti. If you have any question, he will answer you. At the same time, there's a lawyer in France. He took me once to show me Buznika, his horses. I told him, Your Excellency, who are the Muslims in your opinion? He said that we are we know who are the Muslims. He said, we are 7. The 4 sects, the Shia, Ja'farite, the Zayed for Yemen, and Abadi. Abadi are Khawarij. Some of them are in Oman, others are in Algeria and Morocco. The Ismailiyya, Alawiya, and Druze, I mentioned these sects. No, the king said these are not Islam. During that day, they held a conference in Jordan. I noticed that there are 8 sects. I thought perhaps they invited the Ismailiyin because they are their friends. There's a lunch for King Abdullah II, the Emir Zayed ibn Ra'ad. I used to call him Islamic Light because he had a light beard. He is the head of the institution of Ahlul Bayt. I told him what King Hassan II said. Who are the 8th sect? He said the Zahiri. Is that the Zahiri in the world? Yes, because they take the facade of the text. They don't accept the interpretation. What is prohibited is prohibited. What is not is not. So there are hundreds of thousands residing between India and Indonesia and other Asian countries. King Hassan II is the most cultured of all Arab kings, and also Sheikh Zayed. President Hosni Mubarak as well is still alive, the former president. I used to say that Sheikh Zayed is a great person. He used to take money and get a loan to give the Palestinians and to help them out. They used to, back then, the oil was not really, the barrel per barrel was not that costly and overpriced. We cannot lie here. It was back then $3 per barrel. Now it's $108 per barrel. We have to be cautious. President Bashar al-Assad, I've seen him 30 times, but all what he has done has surprised me. I've never really thought that he would do all this. If he wanted to commit suicide, it would have been better. He was perhaps naive. I think I haven't really seen what might insinuate 150,000 deaths, which means every family is mourning. We have spoken of the sources of the news and journalism. The English taught us, because we used to work in England, that the most important thing is that the writing is direct and easy. they said that the cat sat on the map, so every sentence is very clear, very obvious. They don't like the 12-syllable words. They like sentences that are clear and easy to write. I noticed in Arabic that all attempts that the Arabic language is weak, especially the journalistic language, even the weakest, which I found. The sheikhs of the TV, I call them the sheikhs of the TV because I studied literature. They really don't know how to make good grammar in the Arabic language. I am not saying about or talking about Taha Hussein, but we want a clear sentence, clear Arabic correct sentence, grammarly speaking. I'm not saying that we should write like Taha Hussein, but at least a clear sentence. This is every newspaper has a certain style of its own. The words that we use as journalists that we reiterate all the time, I take two styles only. Writing the Hamza in Arabic, the writing of the nouns and the numbers and the figures also is different. This is not difficult at all. And the text that I wrote here, they are saying in the first page, which I have, that the newspapers are about to get extinct. And this is wrong. تكاد تنقرض in Arabic. If I find something in the Holy Quran, they will not really discuss this with me. In the Holy Quran, he says يكاد زيد أن يضيء يكاد ينقرض. It's about to get extinct. يكاد ينقرض. This is a mistake getting reiterated all the time in the newspapers. But it does not, which means sometimes it does not take the which is al-ta'rif in Arabic, which is the the. Some tell me that in the Holy Quran, perhaps it might it is used more than one time. قال بعض, some people have said this means that there is the intention of adding more words. So perhaps it does not take the or al-ta'rif in Arabic. Dun or min dun, with or without, means either it has or it hasn't. So some names are being written as fashion these days. For the past 3 years, they are saying that this person has declared this and that. This is wrong. In Arabic, we should say that the auxiliaries are put as such and they go back to the word before the auxiliary. After the arrival of King Hussein to London, he has declared, not the other way around. This is not acceptable. This is the way we write in the Arabic language. There is a story in tradition. The Wali has said that the Prince of Princes wanted me to demonize Ali ibn Abi Talib. So this is in Arabic. Everyone understood this as he wants, but according to my own experience, it is not difficult to write and learn a true language, a true grammatical language. There are no difficulties, definitely. I am not talking about really degradation. If I want to walk on the path of the Holy Quran, I would have said مركز الدراسات والبحوث, the ECSSR. So the writer is describing how to write sentences in Arabic. The language of the Quran is very clear and very obvious. We should use it in order to write down certain things. I am not saying that I am knowledgeable or the journalist can write the language of Taha Hussein. No, this is wrong. Perhaps it is there and it is possible and we can do it, but we have to try. I shall not speak further. I am ready to hear all your questions, and forget about the 12 midnight. Thank you very much. Thank you for the ECSSR for giving me the opportunity to talk to you.
I would like to thank Mr. Jihad Al-Khazen for this interesting lecture. So you have talked about your long-standing experience in the field of journalism, about the nature of journalistic work, press, and the importance of the accuracy of news, which is considered one of the most important components of journalism and press. Now we would like to open the floor for questions. If you have any question, please introduce yourself and the institution for which you represent. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, Dr. Muhammad As-Saeed, literature Dean in Al-Hassan University, I would like to thank you for this lecture and thank the ECSSR for inviting us to discuss this important topic. You talked about common mistakes in Arab journalism. You talked about the Arabic language and the journalism as well. Can the journalism play a role in improving the Arabic language or maintain and develop the Arabic language? Do you think that the press can play a role in this context? I hope so, because people read newspapers and the articles every day, so we can see a daily reaction to the newspapers and the press, unlike the studies and research. The interest is general and public. When I was preparing the study, for example, and without any respect or request, we have Al-Arabi magazine here. The first topic is about linguistic citizenship. And in Al-Hayat newspaper, I saw a title, Language as a Part of Identity, 4 pages about the language. So this happened in 2 days. My colleague Mustafa wrote an article in Al-Hayat newspaper about the modern journalism and the challenges of the Arabic language. I think that everyone is interested today in improving the Arabic language, but I think that everyone should focus on that and benefit from the development of the Arabic language. What I wanted to focus on is to write a correct sentence, simple Arabic with a correct grammar. So I think that the Arabic language was a hobby for me. I was interested in looking at Sibawayh's theories. I hope that the press and journalism can contribute to maintaining the Arabic language. Today it's part of the problem because we have daily mistakes committed in the press and journalism. We have for his part, from his part, used in Arabic from this side, from the other side. They're trying to translate English sentences into Arabic, and they're not consistent in Arabic. Afif Mubarak, a professor at Al-Hassan University. I would like to thank you for this lecture. I admire your writings, and I admire as well your lectures about writing and Arabic language. My question is the following. In the electronic magazines, newspapers, and websites, we can see a trend of a lack of surveillance, of correction today. In Al-Ahram, for example, in the past, it was really hard to find a mistake in an article. Today, the situation is different. We have many common mistakes, and websites copy from each other. So the mistake occurs in on different platforms. Do you think that this is due to a lack of professionalism or morals? What do you think? Thank you. Thank you for your appreciation. The degradation is happening in each and every field. Sometimes you would feel disappointed. When we republished Al-Hayat, I looked for Dr. Sultan Zayed, who wrote about Arabic nationalism. He was a professor at Princeton and Harvard in 1932. I met him at his daughter's house in Washington. Edward is my friend and his wife as well. When Edward Said died, he was considered to be the leader of the liberal thinking movement. And I think that Nizar Kabani is one of the most successful poets, and he was very brave. And I really enjoyed hearing his poems when I used to visit him at his house. All of those have died today. Mahmoud Darwish, for example, he also died while I was negotiating with him. He had problems in his heart. I think that we do not have today writers which are up to the level of the writers who we lost. Mahmoud Abbas won an award from Al-Faisal Association, King Association. So I think that degradation is happening at all levels in the political field as a result of the revolutions that the Arab world witnessed. In Egypt specifically, the Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, are killing other Sunni Muslims. In the Quran, we can see that this cannot happen. This is not possible. Which means that the people of the Bible, of the Quran, should not kill each other. They should live in peace. But I think that at the end of the day, we should be hopeful and ask God for a better future. I apologized because I was late to reach. We were talking about the electronic press and media. I was in a conference in Dubai, and we were saying that the newspapers are not to be extinct, but they should keep pace with the electronic and online developments. And this is what the newspapers in the United Arab Emirates are trying to do. They are trying to use both traditional and modern media. What do you think about this? This is a good point. And I can say that I agree with you, because the Audit Bureau of Circulation, the company which monitors distribution, is still monitoring the electronic distribution, the number of e-newspapers readers. They consider this as a part of the newspaper sale. But I can tell you that the figures, without no exception, are decreasing every month, and the numbers are decreasing every year. So you can check this on the ABC. So we can, this decrease is there and is ongoing. I read the newspapers every morning, the New York Times and the Washington Post online. And of course, the distribution of the e-newspapers is calculated. And these newspapers are keeping pace with traditional and modern media. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, Khaled Omar, a journalist and writer. Mr. Jihad, we have enjoyed your lecture and we are happy to have you here. I have a question, if possible. I remember that you had an interview with Al-Arabi newspaper in 1996. You said that the chief editor is the most powerful authority in the institution. Today, what do you think about the intruders to the newspapers, to the media? Do you think that they would benefit from the current situation amid this media landscape? Do you think that the decision maker still relies on the written text and the printed text? Mr. Ibrahim Al-Abid was saying that it is agreed today that written or traditional media can coexist with modern media. And I think that today there are many TV channels that are present today due to the presence of newspapers. For example, Ash-Shuruq, Al-Watan have both newspapers and TV channels. And as I know that advertisers in the UK have a condition, which is to have their advertisement in the newspapers and on TV as well. What do you think? Concerning the last point, this is a good commercial position. They know that the newspaper is degrading and regressing and is trying to focus on the TV, which is part of the modern media. I think that it's a good idea. But when it comes to the internet and the social media platforms, in Lebanon, they used to say every citizen is a guard, and today we say every citizen is a journalist, which means that there is no credibility because you do not know the source of the information and there is no accountability and surveillance. And this, of course, creates chaos. And it also sometimes causes or attacks the liberty and freedom of some people, as well as their privacy, of course. I think that this modern media cannot gain the same level of credibility as the traditional media. In the past, we used to say that, for example, the virginity of women once lost we cannot get it back. So this is very important, and the same concept applies to journalism today. Today, we should choose. The Arab media has always struggled. There are no enough freedoms, and I think that there should be a certain level of consensus with the state. Usually the official should fear the press. Here the press fears the officials. And I think that this was the situation in Lebanon. Handurus is one of the most important journalists in the US. I'm telling you a story from the 60s when I was a student. He wrote an article, how to close a sound bank. And he sent to the Time Life saying that he has wrote this article. He told Al-Karami that he stopped in Lebanon while he was going to the Far East during the Second World War. He told him, Mr. Prime Minister, the intelligence wrote a report about you. And then he replied, Mr. Prime Minister, all of those should apologize to this journalist. And Mr. Prime Minister, if they do not apologize, our newspaper will declare war on Lebanon. And I can assure you that you will never receive $1 extra of American assistance. So Rashid Karami told us, or was asking us, do you think that this is true? Can he do that? Rashid Karami speaks English, but I think that he didn't have a good English. He was a wise man. He said, we cannot accept this, and if what you're saying is true, we are going to investigate, and I think that apologies will not be enough. I will be sanctioning them. So I think that for the first time this happened, the journalist was threatening the official. So I think that in the West, they have a higher level of freedom, and this is not the situation in this region of the world. However, I think that in Kuwait, in Lebanon, in Egypt, there is a certain degree of freedom. In other countries, the journalist should make a lot of calculations before attacking the government. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, can you please stand up because we would like to see you? Please. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, I'm Khalid Al-Abaidat from Jordan, and I am a consultant for Wise Global Company. Mr. Jihad, I would like to thank you for your lecture. Good night or good evening to you and to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I heard you describing at the beginning of this lecture what happened in the Arab world as an Israeli spring. And we know that the press has played a pivotal role in this spring, regardless if it's Arab or Israeli. I have two related questions. The first one is, does this mean that the Arab press has become under the control of the Israelis? And the second part of the question is it easy to control the Arab citizens even though the press is controlled by Israel? The Arab press is not controlled by Israel. I don't think that Israel has an influence on any newspaper. Maybe a certain Arab newspaper has committed some mistakes. It's a wiser interpretation. On the other hand, there are some newspapers who have a certain level of credibility and which can be trusted. But on the other hand, there is a majority of newspapers that do not have the same level of credibility. I said that it's an Israeli spring because the only beneficiary from this spring is Israel. I don't think that Israel was responsible for the revolutions, but Israel is benefiting from the revolutions. So we can take the example of Egypt and Libya, where there are 3 million armed people, armed men, and there are many armed militias. In Iraq, for example, there is an unannounced civil war. If we watch TV every day, we can see that there was 20, 30 or 40 people killed in the Arab region. We were complaining about Israel who killed people in this region, but the number of people killed by Israel are not as many as the people killed that are being killed today. I think that we, the old generation, were proud of the great journalists who died. And I think that the journalists today are not up to the level of the journalists with whom I worked when I was in my 20s. Mr. Jihad, I have a question. I would like to ask you the following question. You said that the Arab press and the current Arab journalists are not similar to the journalists and press in the past. What are the steps, the measures that should be taken in order to develop journalism? You're saying that the Arabic language is not hard. The most important thing is to have a room for freedom. As a journalist, you should make sure that you can visit all Arab countries, regardless if you have criticized the government or not. If, for example, in Lebanon, I decide to attack a certain party, what's the guarantee that the newspaper will not be bombed? I should be very careful because I'm responsible for my safety and the safety of my colleagues. So the most important thing is to have a room for freedom. The journalist should be able to say what he wants without facing sanctions on himself or on his family. In Syria, for example, this is not possible, and the sanctions are really tough. I think that this room of freedom is the most important component. We also the media needs advertisements, ads, and should be independent, but at the end of the day, this freedom is the most important thing. There should be a law that protects the journalist, the freedom of expression. This doesn't mean that the journalist can insult people or dishonor them, but I think that this room for freedom should be there. The government that is working for the sake of the people shouldn't be scared, shouldn't fear anything. I cannot tell you enough about the prosperity of the United Arab Emirates. 2 or 3 weeks ago, I have attended the government summit. Everything has become computerized, and the new technology is there in the United Arab Emirates. I told my friends, and I told even His Highness Sheikh Mohammed and His Excellency Mohammed Al-Girgawi, I cannot praise you enough because it is not possible to hear different opinions. For example, it is not always easy to negotiate with the journalists and convince them. There is a certain level of how can we, for example, negotiate with the Muslim Brotherhood? It is not possible. So you think that the changes that happened in the Arab region, the Arab Spring, have they helped in giving room for freedom in Egypt, for example? Do you think that the journalist can speak freely and express his opinion without being held accountable? I'm not defending Mubarak. Before, there was a room for freedom. Specifically in Egypt and Kuwait. In Egypt, I asked Mr. Mubarak a question. I have interviewed him more than 20 times. I told him, when would you appoint a vice president? Every time he used to give me a different answer. Once he told me that he looked for one, but he didn't find. So the journalists attacked him. They told him, who do you think you are? And among the 80 million Egyptians, haven't you found a suitable vice president? And I think that at that time there was a room for freedom to see this. There was a certain level of freedom. Maybe this room is wider today. In Kuwait, Saddam Hussein is not there anymore, Kuwait is independent, and there is a room for freedom. Why are they nagging? Why the journalists are nagging there? I think that nagging has become a trend today, and people are misusing this room for freedom. In Bahrain, in Kuwait, the people want to be part of the government, and I think that today this is not easy, and there is a misuse of authorities and powers. Mohammed Al-Ghazi, a political researcher at the ECSSR. I would like to thank you for this valuable lecture. I think that when we read the title, we would expect a comparison between the press in the West and the East. And I would have expected maybe a more in-depth comparison between both. I think that all of us know that the press in the West is objective, neutral, unbiased. I think that there is a certain level of neutrality. And of course, the press there can impact the public opinion. How can we make sure that the press is objective, but at the same time governed by the law, and impacts the people and the public opinion, and creates the public opinion, but sometimes we can see that it overshadows the public opinion. Maybe in the Arab world, the neutrality is not there. The press doesn't impact the public opinion. And maybe you have given some reasons which are behind that. You talked about fear and lack of freedom. Do you think that these are the real reasons behind that? Today, for example, we have freedom, but we still see that some newspapers are still not doing well. I'm not only talking about the Arabic language and about the grammar rules, but I think that the press language, journalistic language is lacking. Do you think that there are deeper reasons behind that? In the Western press, there is a higher level of professionalism. I can give you a clear example about that. New York Times and Washington Post, I can tell you that every piece of news is accurate. There is no room for mistake, but in the opinion margin, you can see all kinds of opinions. So in the opinion articles, you can read all opinions, and in order to hide this biased position to Israel, some moderate Jewish writers, who are among the best writers, try to write on the editorial board, which is the opinion of the board. So we should take the news from them, which is accurate. And these newspapers try to impact the public opinion through these editorials and opinions. We can give an example of a father who has children, a house, and who has to pay tuition fees for all of them. He would not act like Mother Teresa. He would try to protect his interests. I think that in some Arab countries, the situation is better than others. I hope that the situation continues to improve, because, as you said, when there was freedom in Egypt, many mistakes were committed. And I gave you the example of Ahmad Shafiq. And there are many other Ahmad Shafiqs or examples of this attack on these political figures with no basis. Good evening. I'm Salim, a journalist. I'm happy to be among you here today and would like to thank the ECSSR for giving us this opportunity. Concerning the competition between the modern and traditional media, I think that it's a positive competition because it decreases the costs of printing. I think that modern media also is advancing technology in the field of press and journalism. I think that one should understand the limits of freedom, and the journalist should understand the meaning of real freedom. My question is, are the Arab newspapers published in London implementing the standards of credibility? You talked about the necessity to have two sources and to make sure that the news is accurate. And do you think that the publishing laws in the UK are efficient? Thank you. Very good question. The immigrant newspapers such as Al-Sharq Al-Awsat and Al-Hayat are based in London but cover the Arab region. So what applies to the Arab newspapers applies to these immigrant newspapers. Nizar Kabani, for example, was, I would not say aggressive, but he was offensive. He wanted to access the news and all the possible information. And I think that when I used to read articles, or Nizar Kabani, when he used to read articles, he used to change one word only. He used to contact the department responsible for this and choose the most accurate word. My objective was to read the newspaper every day, but he used to think that the words are his daughters and he's responsible for defending their honor. So I think that there is a competition with the internet, between the traditional media and the internet, and there are some complementary elements. The most important thing is to have an integrated system so as to allow the newspaper to get revenues from the printed newspapers and from the e-newspapers. As we said, the TV is, of course, will last and is a component of modern media. But I would like to say that we are suffering from two things. I talked about the lack of freedom, and I would like here to talk about the lack of access to information. Here, the newspaper or journalists would try to approach the government in order to get information. In the United Arab Emirates, for example, the people come here in order to access the information. Good evening, Dr. Ali Al-Amoudi, a senior journalist at Takrir in ADNOC. We are delighted to have you here, Mr. Jihad. It's a great honor for the journalists in the Arab region. You are a person who has a mission and a vision, even if you're outside the Arab region. There is an English proverb, Mr. Jihad, and you have come from these countries. It says, the empathy can make the most sound. And this impacts the press and the media. This example applies to the situation here in the Arab region. As you have said, there is no credibility and there is a lack of freedom. And you said that when you report news in the UK or in Western countries, the UK law prohibits you from giving your opinion. So objectivity is stipulated by the law. Are there limitations to reporting news in the UK? When it comes to the Arab world, the second part of the question is about the Arabic language. I think that the Arabic language today is suffering and it is being misused. His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid issued a decision in Dubai which obliges the public institutions to use the Arabic language. It's a first step in order to activate and improve the level or the quality of Arabic language in the UAE. However, the Arabic language is still suffering and the English language is still reigning. At the academic level, in the universities, for example, the students are requested to pass the TOEFL or the IELTS, and in addition to other examples. Why don't they don't take into consideration the Arabic language, and how can we improve the situation of the Arabic language today? Thank you. I can tell you, I wish we can improve the status of the Arabic language today. In the Western journalism, there is a law. We cannot talk about limitations. This applies to the UK and the US. So when there is a law, you know your limits. You know who's responsible for you, who's monitoring your work. So you can be held accountable in accordance with the law. Let's forget about Beirut. Let's talk about London. In London, I write every day. And I have never apologized for writing a certain article, because when I write an article, I base my information on evidence, and I sometimes and I keep my interviews with the presidents and with the ministers. So in the court, they ask you to keep your notes, and this is what I do. I keep the notes on which my article is based. For 35 years, I've never been obliged to withdraw or apologize for any article, but I have been trained there in the West. This is why I know my limits. For example, when it comes to Arab journalists who go to London, they do not have the experience and the training, and they lose the cases when they face me. I remember an Arab journalist who used to attack Mahdi Tajer every day. Mahdi Tajer raised the case against him and won. And I think that this doesn't apply to this Arab region, because there is no law that can protect the journalists. So the second day, the journalist was bagging Al-Mahdi in the title of the magazine, not to eliminate the case fees. I think that this is quite funny, but the transparent and honest journalist is very well known. And I hope that the Arab journalists would take into consideration the public opinion on the internet, which is expressed on the electronic platforms. I think that the law today is not being able to regulate the electronic press, because the electronic press is much wider than the traditional press. Mr. Jihad, based on your long-standing experience in the field of journalism and media, do you really think that the West press conveys the situation in the Arab world with objectivity? The news are highly objective, but there are the comments and observations. For example, when there is a leftist journalist, this shows in the comments of the journalist. When we have, for example, a rightist, also the comments are influenced by the orientation of the journalist. Sometimes in The Guardian, for example, which is a leftist liberal newspaper, a certain piece of news would be analyzed in a different way than The Telegraph or other rightist newspapers. Of course, what I can say is the information is always accurate, but the interpretation differs. And this also applies to the way news were conveyed on Syria and Egypt. And the newspapers, for example, try to highlight the positive things that are in accordance with its orientation. And I think that we are aware of the orientation of all the newspapers, and we can tell about it even before reading the articles. Walid Hamad, an engineer. How can we improve professionalism and journalism? As you said, the journalism is divided into two parts, the opinion and the accurate news. So how can we improve the levels of professionalism in the Arab region? What are the added value that we can give to journalism in order to have professional journalists? I think that journalism is kind of a talent, but according to you, how can it be improved? The judgment is in the hands of the reader. The reader would judge if the news is objective or biased. And so I think that the reader is the king. And I believe that everything starts at the university, in the faculties of journalism. I can talk about the university where I studied. I think that the professors were objective, and they taught us the real journalism in a very sound academic way. But when it comes to practical journalism, the situation is different. We live in countries where the situation is difficult, and you should make, and the Arab journalists should make harder calculations than the Western journalists. And usually the Arab journalist chooses what is the news that is convenient to the newspaper. This is not what we were taught in the West. You start with the direct news, and then you give the background about the story at the end of the article. When we had the NLF, the National Front, and the Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Yemen. And when the country was independent, the reporting differed from one newspaper to another. And they came to us, and we told them that we are the majority. However, at that time, the Egyptian media was in control, and when the country was independent, the National Liberal Front was in control. So as a reader, you have the judgment. You can decide who's objective and who's not. And I think that this depends on the nature of the journalist, orientation of the journalist and the newspaper. So if you know that the newspaper is leftist, you would know how it would deal with a certain piece of news. I think that we should aim to become as accurate in our reporting as the Western press. David Cameron. it may be called a stupid ass by a certain newspaper and can be blamed. But I cannot say, for example, in the UK that he is a thief. So there's a difference. There's a difference between the news and the opinion. So news and views. I think that if we are optimistic, we'll hear good news. I would like to take a question from ladies. The ladies. Could you please stand up so we can see you? And introduce yourself before the question. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Mr. Jihad Al-Khazen. I have a question. Do you think there is enough intellectual room for the Arab citizen to express his opinion, or do you think that there is freedom of expression here in the Arab region? The situation differs from one country to another. In some countries there is chaos, such as Lebanon. Everyone expresses his opinion, and maybe all opinions are wrong, and there are no limits, even and regulations. Even the courts. I was transferred to the courts many times, but I was never. The order was never issued, or the sentence was never issued. Rashid Karame was in the Sarai, in the government building, did a statement, and we covered this statement. We were accused of revealing a secret. So, and Ghassan Twaine at that time decided to boycott the coverage. I was in Oman after that, and when I came back, I was arrested by the authorities in Lebanon. And I think that, and at that time I was blamed for this coverage, and I was concerned because I was a member of the syndicate and I wanted to get married. And maybe the judge at that time thought of detaining me or arresting me for 3 or 4 days. But at the end he told me, sit down, and told me that I will not do that. So I think that we would need few years in order to, I think that few years will not be enough in order to reach the same level of credibility and transparency that we have in the West. I think that we should start by knowing our limits, and at the same time, this should start from education. Journalists usually are taught in universities and schools, and in order to be professional, they should have the capacity to translate things objectively. I think that this is quite limited and scarce in the Arab region. Good evening. I have 2 questions. Could you please introduce yourself? Mamdouh Taha, a journalist and writer. In the past, journalism used to unify and politics used to disperse or divide. Today, it's the opposite. Journalism is dividing and politics is unifying. Do you think that the press regressed and politics advanced? You've been living in the West for 30 years or more. And when we talk about the Arab Spring, we say that the West has called the revolutions in the Arab world, in addition to the conspiracies and everything, as Arab Spring. And the Western media is today supporting what's happening in the Arab region, or the chaos in the Arab region. My question is, how do you assess the Western coverage of the events in the Arab region, and how do you assess assess the Arab-speaking media coverage of what's happening in the Arab world? Concerning the first part of the question, the Arab press does not have enough influence to divide or unify. I think that the Arab press is blamed and accused, and it is not capable of controlling the public opinion. The revolutions in Tunisia and other countries stemmed from specific reasons. When it comes to the coverage of Arab events, this coverage usually reflects the orientation of the newspaper. For example, what was written about Egypt, according to my personal opinion, was maybe a mistake or was done on purpose. In Egypt, for example, I know the president, the ministers, and maybe the taxi driver as a journalist. However, people do not have enough information about Egypt and what's good or bad for Egypt. So, as I said, when it comes to Egypt or other Arab countries, the coverage was did the mistakes sometimes on purpose. And the mistakes were desired. The Muslim Brotherhood was toppled. I do not want to talk about them enough, but I think that strange things happened. The Muslim Brotherhood accessed power, and they opened some tunnels to Gaza and then closed others. And Omar Suleiman was my friend. I used to trust him, and he was one of the most intelligent politicians in Egypt. He didn't close any tunnel. He gave me a map, and Mrs. Al-Husseini was with me. He told me, we know each and every tunnel, and we know the rent of this tunnel, and who owns the tunnels, and he said that the rent for weapons is the most expensive. I was sitting with him. Someone called him. He told him, yes, Mr. President, it was President Carter. He went to the bureau and he gave him a list of what they are doing for the Palestinians in Gaza. And he was talking about the tunnels. So he gave him a long list about what is being provided. But what happened is that the Muslim Brotherhood closed the tunnels, despite the fact that Hamas is supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. The tunnels were closed and all channels were closed. And today they are accused of supporting them, of attacking the prisoners and attacking the prisons and releasing the prisoners. I think that the situation is quite complicated at the level of freedom of the internet competition. But I think that it will persist, it will survive, but we should know how to deal with it. And I hope that the Arab reader would have enough experience to distinguish what is objective reporting and what is not. We'll take the last question. Last two questions. Gentleman at the end. Taysir Sulaiman, a public employee. Thank you, Mr. Jihad, for your valuable lecture. My question is, in Israel, or Israel is building settlements in Palestine, and we can see that Israeli press or journalism is working to serve the Israeli mentality and settlement. But in the Arab world, we consider Palestine our own country and nation, but what is your assessment of Arab journalism coverage when it comes, or in terms of the Palestinian cause coverage? As you know, in the Arab country or countries today, we have many causes. We used to have only the Palestinian issue cause, but today we have many others. There is an important thing when it comes to the Israeli press. Writing about the Israeli government. I call them Nazist, apartheid, killers of mothers and children. So I used to give my opinion about people, but not about the government itself. And this is why I try to avoid racism, because if I attack the government itself, I would be accused of racism. I have been transferred many times to the courts, but no sentence was issued against me. I opened Google and I saw that my name is mentioned in more than 26,000 articles. 4 articles are about anti-Jihad, anti-Semitism. And I would like to tell you that Haaretz is one of the best newspapers in Israel, and it defends the Palestinians. Jadon Liva wrote a month ago and said, if I was a teacher, I would talk about the attacks facing Palestinians and the genocides committed by Israel in Palestinian cities. And he is an Israeli. I know also the Israeli peace group, or there is Nuri Pillet, and she is the daughter of a leader of War of 67. Her daughter was killed in a terrorist attack in Jerusalem. She has become an activist. But to be fair, there are neo-Nazists and neo-Nazists, and they have also good people. Once I was in Qatar with one of them. I will tell you his name, as one of this peace movement. I told him, I have reached an opinion about the Jewish. I told him the bad Jewish is the worst person on earth, and the good Jewish is the best person on earth. So he told me, well, where do you place me? I told him, I don't want you to know. So they have good people, and I hope that we would appreciate their efforts. Even in the US, they are there. There is Goliath, a book which I criticized. It's a Jewish American author, and he documented all mistakes committed against the Palestinian people. So you have these kind of people and the neo-Nazists. But if we want to attack, we have to attack individuals, not the whole society or the government. Even William Hague, the US or UK foreign minister, when there were prisoners and Israeli prisoners in Gaza, he used to write statements sympathizing with the Israeli people. I told him in the newspaper, look at the Palestinians, the children and women who are detained in Israel and who are Palestinian. Why don't you sympathize with them? He sent me a letter and he asked me to withdraw my statement. I told him, this is my opinion. I sent my opinion, and if you're not okay with that, take me to court. So when you're in accordance with the law, you shouldn't fear anyone. Thank you. We would take the last question. Good evening, Mr. Jihad. We really enjoyed this lecture and dialogue. I have a very specific question about the role of Arab journalists. And if the West or UK newspapers allows you to take part in English-speaking shows, so what is the room that the well-known Arab journalists have? And if you, as a journalist and as a well-known figure, would like to maybe participate or take part in a certain talk show, would you be allowed to do that? And do you think that it is possible for you to speak with courage? Or you think that this is a selective process because by following the English-speaking shows, there is this, the Arab guests go through a selective process. We would not like now to talk about the Arab media, but I would like to focus on this selective process. And sometimes the people or journalists who are less competent are chosen. Could you please clarify this if possible? Thank you. Yes, of course, there is this process of selective process. If an Arab journalist is invited to take part in a show and if he attacks Israel, I don't think that he will be invited again. So I think that this selective process is there. Arab journalists, for example, appear on TV or on radio in London. They talk in a moderate way. They are very moderate. And they only attack when they write in Arab newspapers. But for me, if a journalist attacks harshly, is not invited again. The problem is not this selective process, but the problem is that the Israeli universities have a high influence on the media, and I think that this applies more on the US than the UK, and it's there in every country. I would like to pinpoint a positive aspect. Everyone is against Israel. The churches in the US are against Israel. And all what is issued by these churches condemns Israel. And in every university there is the BBS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So there is this system against Israel in every university, and this has moved to Europe today. Many European companies are threatening not to deal with Israeli companies anymore, and many European companies have withdrawn their investments from Israel. There is a campaign against Israel in the whole world, even in the US. The books which were issued lately are in evidence about that. I do not want to talk about this, not to fight with anyone. And even these books that are issued in the West, Darkness at Night is one of the most famous books in the 20th century. And 3 to 4 years ago, I assessed the invention of a Jewish book, which is in the same orientation, and which talks about the disputes of tribes between an Arab and Muslim states, and when the people were obliged to go to East Europe or to flee to East Europe. He is a professor from Tel Aviv, and and Plato also talks about the Atlantis or other theories from Babylon. So this is what we learned from Islam. And the edition which is in Topkapi is the original edition. And you need a scientist to be able to read it. I do not believe anything about this. They talk about the Palestinians and Palestine, which was later on established. But the fact is that Palestine has always been there. And Amr ibn al-Khattab talked to the patriarch and asked him to pray with him. And he saw that the Christians are like the Jewish. They are fighting on the church over the church of nativity.
I've seen Zaki Nusayba at the hotel, 1,400 years old. It is there. The family is there. Khazar, for instance, says this is our country. Abigdor Liber now is from a part of Ukraine. He is born there. Now the Russians are asking to get it. He used to work at the cabaret as a strong man. So as such, we arrive to the end of our seminar. I would like to thank you all. Thank Mr. Jihad Al-Khazen, who has given us his experience in the field of journalism and talked to us about journalism in the Western world and compared it to the Arabic region. I would like to thank you all for your kind attention, for your active participation in the discussions of the seminar. Hope to see you at the 19th conference entitled Technology, Challenges of the Future, which will be held next Tuesday and Wednesday, 18th and 19th of March, starting at 10 o'clock in the hall of Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan. For further information about the conference, you can visit the ECSSR's website.